The training yard fell silent as 12 soldiers closed in around her, their expressions mixing amusement with contempt. "Wrong place, girl." The lead instructor sneered, blocking her path to the combat qualification course. Irene Hill stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, her frame slight against the wall of muscle surrounding her. What happened in the next 60 seconds would shatter every assumption they'd made about the quiet logistics clerk who'd spent 9 months being dismissed, overlooked, and told she didn't belong. But they didn't know about the thousands of hours she'd spent in shadows, preparing for exactly this moment. They were about to learn. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more inspiring stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Valor's training grounds as Irene Hill completed her 200th push-up. It was 0430 hours, 2 hours before the official physical training session would begin, and she was alone as always. She'd learned early in her deployment that being seen working this hard only invited mockery. So she trained in solitude, in darkness, where no one could question why a logistics clerk needed this level of conditioning. At 23 years old, Irene had been stationed at Camp Valor for 9 months, assigned to inventory management and supply chain coordination. On paper, it was respectable work, essential to keeping a forward operating base functional. In reality, it meant she was invisible, relegated to spreadsheets and storage rooms while others trained for the missions that mattered. She finished her workout and headed to the shower facilities, timing her arrival to avoid the morning rush. The base was just beginning to wake, generators humming to life, the smell of breakfast drifting from the mess hall. By the time most soldiers started their day, Irene had already completed a workout that would leave many of them gasping. The morning briefing took place at 700 inches, the main operations center. Irene sat in her usual spot near the back, her notebook ready, though she already knew she wouldn't be called upon for anything significant. Captain Brennan stood at the front, his weathered face serious as he addressed the assembled personnel. "Listen up," Brennan announced, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in service. "Command has approved a new combat readiness initiative. Every soldier at this base, regardless of specialization, will undergo advanced combat qualification testing over the next month." A murmur rippled through the room. Irene's pen paused over her notepad, her heart rate quickening slightly. This was different. This was opportunity. Brennan continued. "The qualification course includes hand-to-hand combat, tactical response scenarios, and physical endurance challenges. Those who pass will be eligible for cross-training in combat operations. Those who don't," he paused, his gaze sweeping the room, "will remain in their current assignments." Sergeant Dalton, the base's senior combat instructor, stepped forward. He was a mountain of a man, 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle, with a reputation for breaking recruits who couldn't meet his standards. "The course isn't designed to be easy," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "It's designed to separate those who can handle themselves in hostile situations from those who can't. If you're not combat material, this course will make that abundantly clear." His eyes found Irene in the back row, and something like amusement flickered across his face. Several nearby soldiers noticed the look and followed his gaze. Irene kept her expression neutral, but she felt the familiar weight of judgment settling over her. After the briefing dispersed, she overheard conversations that confirmed what she already knew. "There's no way logistics personnel pass this course," Private Torres was saying to his companion. "Especially not," he lowered his voice slightly, "Hill. She's what, barely 100 pounds? Dalton will eat her alive. I heard she requested combat training months ago." Another voice added, "Command denied it. Said her body composition wasn't suitable for combat operations." Body composition? The words they used when they meant too small, too weak, too female. Irene had heard every variation over the past 9 months. She'd learned to let the words slide past her, to focus on what she could control rather than what others believed about her. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Irene had been training for combat since before she joined the military. Growing up in a small industrial town in Eastern Europe, she'd watched her older brother train in Sambo, a Soviet martial art that combined judo, wrestling, and striking techniques. When her brother's instructor saw her mimicking the moves from the sidelines, he'd invited her to join the class. For 8 years, from age 10 to 18, Irene had trained 6 days a week. She'd competed in regional tournaments, consistently defeating opponents who outweighed her by 30 or 40 pounds. She'd learned that technique could overcome strength, that speed could defeat power, that the human body had vulnerable points that didn't care about size differences. But when she'd enlisted, she'd kept those skills hidden. Military culture values certain types of strength, and she'd quickly learned that a small woman claiming combat proficiency was met with skepticism at best, hostility at worst. So she'd accepted her logistics assignment, filed her paperwork, counted her inventory, and trained in secret, waiting for an opportunity to prove what she already knew. Now that opportunity had arrived. Over the next week, Irene maintained her routine. She rose at 0400, completed her solitary training, showered, and reported for her regular duties. But she also began studying the combat qualification requirements that had been posted on the base bulletin board. The course would test multiple disciplines: striking, grappling, weapons retention, multiple attacker scenarios, and endurance challenges. She noticed that other soldiers had also begun preparing. The base gym, usually populated only by the combat units, now saw increased traffic from support personnel hoping to qualify for cross-training. Irene avoided these public training sessions, knowing that her presence would only invite commentary that would distract from her preparation. Instead, she found alternative training locations. There was a storage area behind the vehicle maintenance bay where damaged equipment was kept awaiting repair. The space was rarely visited after hours, and it provided enough room for her to practice footwork, striking combinations, and grappling movements against imaginary opponents. She also began observing Sergeant Dalton's training methods. During her lunch breaks, she would walk past the combat training grounds where he was drilling the infantry units. She watched how he structured his sessions, the specific techniques he emphasized, the weaknesses he exploited when sparring with trainees. Dalton favored powerful, direct attacks. He was strong enough to overwhelm most opponents through sheer force, and his teaching reflected that bias. His students learned to rely on power and aggression, which worked well when they had physical advantages. But Irene could see the gaps in their technique, the overcommitments that left them vulnerable to counters, the predictable patterns that a trained eye could exploit. 2 weeks before the qualification testing was scheduled to begin, Irene requested a meeting with Captain Brennan. She'd rehearsed what she would say, anticipating the resistance she would face. Brennan's office was functional and sparse, decorated only with commendations from his years of service. He looked up from his paperwork as she entered, his expression polite but distant. "Hill, what can I do for you?" "Sir, I want to formally register for the combat qualification course." Brennan set down his pen, studying her with eyes that had seen too many soldiers make promises they couldn't keep. "Hill, you understand what this course entails? It's not a fitness test. It's designed to simulate real combat conditions." "I understand, sir. Your current assignment is valuable. Logistics is essential to our operations. There's no shame in—" "I'm not looking for an alternative, sir," Irene interrupted gently. "I'm asking for the opportunity to qualify." Brennan leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. "I've reviewed your file, Hill. Your performance in logistics has been exemplary. But combat operations require specific physical capabilities. The course has a high failure rate even among infantry personnel. Then I'll be prepared to fail, sir. But I'd like the chance to try." The morning of the qualification course arrived with oppressive humidity that made the air feel thick enough to drink. Irene stood among 47 other soldiers in the assembly area outside the combat training facility. She was the only woman present, and one of only 6 support personnel attempting the qualification. The rest were infantry, reconnaissance, or military police soldiers whose primary roles involved combat operations. Sergeant Dalton emerged from the facility, accompanied by 3 assistant instructors. His presence seemed to make the morning heat more intense. "Welcome to combat qualification," he announced, his voice carrying across the assembly area. "Over the next 4 weeks, you will be tested on every aspect of close quarters combat. Some of you will pass. Most of you will not." His gaze swept across the assembled soldiers, lingering momentarily on Irene. "This course does not care about your feelings, your excuses, or your limitations. It cares only about results. Can you defend yourself? Can you neutralize a threat? Can you protect your fellow soldiers when it matters most? If you can't answer yes to these questions by the end of this course, then you don't belong in combat operations." The first week focused on striking fundamentals, punches, kicks, elbow strikes, knee attacks. Dalton's teaching was brutally direct. He demonstrated each technique once, then had the soldiers pair up to practice on focus mitts and heavy bags. Irene was paired with Private Torres, who stood nearly a foot taller than her and outweighed her by at least 70 pounds. "Try not to hurt yourself," Torres said as they began drilling. His tone wasn't cruel, just matter of fact, as if her inability was already assumed. Irene said nothing, focusing instead on the techniques. She let Torres work first, holding the focus mitts as he threw powerful but telegraphed combinations. His punches had force behind them, but they were slow, predictable. She could read each strike before it launched. When it was her turn, she adjusted her stance. Slightly, her weight distributed differently than Dalton had instructed. Torres noticed and smirked. "You're supposed to keep your feet shoulder-width apart." Irene ignored him and began her combination. Her punches were fast, precise, snapping into the mitts with sharp cracks that surprised Torres enough to make him step backward. She transitioned smoothly between strikes, her footwork fluid, her hips generating power that seemed impossible from her small frame. "Damn," Torres muttered, his smirk fading. "Where'd you learn to hit like that?" "Practice," Irene replied simply, resetting her stance for another combination. Word began to spread among the trainees that the small logistics clerk could actually fight. By the 3rd day of striking training, soldiers were finding excuses to watch when Irene worked the heavy bag. Her combinations were faster and more technically sound than most of the infantry personnel, her strikes landing with precision that spoke of years of training rather than weeks. Sergeant Dalton noticed the attention she was receiving. During a water break, he approached her station, his massive frame casting a shadow over her. "Hill," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes assessing, "you've had training." It wasn't a question, but Irene answered anyway. "Yes, Sergeant." "What kind?" "Sambo, Sergeant. 8 years." Dalton's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Sambo was a respected discipline, known for producing fighters who were dangerous in both striking and grappling ranges. "Why didn't you mention this when you enlisted?" "Didn't seem relevant to logistics, Sergeant." A hint of something, perhaps respect, perhaps annoyance, flickered across Dalton's face. "Everything's relevant in combat, Hill. Remember that." The second week introduced grappling techniques, takedowns, submissions, ground control. This was where Irene's Sambo training truly shined. While other trainees struggled to understand the mechanics of leverage and body positioning, she moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent thousands of hours on the mat. Her first grappling match was against Corporal Hayes, a military police officer with 40 pounds on her, and a wrestling background from his high school years. Hayes approached the match with visible confidence, clearly expecting an easy victory. They started from standing position, and Hayes immediately shot for a double-leg takedown, intending to use his weight advantage to pin her. But Irene had anticipated the attack. She sprawled backward, her hips driving down as her hands controlled Hayes' head, stuffing the takedown attempt before it could develop. Before Hayes could reset, Irene circled to his side and secured a front headlock, her arms tight around his neck and shoulder. Hayes tried to pull away, but she moved with him, maintaining control as she worked for a better position. In Sambo, the front headlock was a dominant control position, and Irene had spent years learning to finish from there. She waited for Hayes to make his next move. When he tried to circle away, she used his momentum against him, throwing her leg over his back and rolling him to the ground. They hit the mat with Irene on top, her weight distributed across Hayes' upper body as she transitioned smoothly into a modified arm triangle choke. Hayes tapped frantically against the mat within seconds, his face reddening as the choke cut off his blood flow. Dalton called time, and Irene released immediately, offering her hand to help Hayes up. Hayes accepted the hand, his expression a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. Where the hell did that come from? Technique, Irene replied quietly. The other trainees had stopped their own matches to watch. The facility fell into an uncomfortable silence as they processed what they'd just witnessed. The small logistics clerk had just submitted a trained wrestler in under 30 seconds. Dalton's voice cut through the silence. That's what proper technique looks like, people. Hill just demonstrated that size doesn't matter if you understand leverage and timing. Everybody, back to your matches. You've got a lot to learn. Over the following days, Irene continued to exceed expectations. In striking drills, she outscored most of her peers. In grappling, she submitted opponents who outweighed her significantly. In tactical scenarios, she demonstrated situational awareness and decision-making that impressed even the assistant instructors. But success brought new problems. Some of the trainees began to resent her performance. Private Torres, who'd initially been respectful, now made comments about show-offs and trying too hard. Others questioned whether Dalton was going easy on her, suggesting that her victories were somehow illegitimate. The resentment crystallized during the third week when rankings were posted for the midterm evaluation. Irene was ranked third overall, behind only 2 infantry specialists, who'd been training in combatives for years. Her name on that list, positioned above dozens of combat soldiers, created a ripple of discontent through the course. "This is bullshit," she heard someone mutter in the mess hall that evening. "She's gaming the system somehow." "Dalton's probably giving her points for effort," another voice added. "No way, she's actually better than half the infantry guys here." Irene kept her head down and finished her meal in silence. She'd learned long ago that defending herself only made the resentment worse. Better to let her performance speak for itself. But the situation was about to escalate beyond mere resentment. The final week of the course included a culminating exercise called the Gauntlet, a scenario-based test where trainees would face multiple opponents in rapid succession, simulating a real-world situation where they'd need to fight their way through enemy combatants. The morning before the Gauntlet, Sergeant Dalton gathered the remaining 32 trainees. 15 had already dropped from the course, unable to meet the physical or technical demands. "Tomorrow's exercise will determine your final rankings," he announced. "You'll enter the combat house and face a series of opponents. Your goal is to neutralize each threat and advance to the extraction point. You'll be scored on technique, efficiency, and tactical awareness." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled soldiers. "This is not a sparring match. This is as close to real combat as we can safely simulate. Injuries are possible. Failure is likely. But those who succeed will have earned their qualification." That evening, as Irene prepared her gear for the next day's test, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. A group of trainees, including Torres and Hayes, were gathered near the equipment storage area, their voices low but audible. "I'm just saying, she needs to understand her place," Torres was saying. "Dalton might be impressed by her little martial arts tricks, but that doesn't mean she belongs in combat operations." "So what are you suggesting?" Hayes asked. "Tomorrow, during the Gauntlet, we make sure she gets a reality check. All of us rotate into her scenario. Show her what real combat looks like when you're facing opponents who aren't holding back. Dalton will notice if we target her specifically," someone else pointed out. "So, it's a combat scenario. We're supposed to fight realistically. If she can't handle multiple opponents, that proves she doesn't belong. Irene moved away before they could notice her presence. Her heart was racing, but her mind was clear. They were planning to gang up on her during tomorrow's test, to use the scenario as cover for teaching her a lesson. It was exactly the kind of situation she'd feared, not an honest test of her skills, but a coordinated effort to put her back in what they considered her proper place. She had two choices. She could report the conversation to Dalton, which might stop the plan but would also confirm in everyone's minds that she needed protection. Or she could face what was coming and prove, once and for all, that she belonged exactly where she was. Irene looked at her reflection in the window of her quarters. The slight young woman staring back at her had been underestimated her entire life. Tomorrow, 12 soldiers were going to learn why that was a mistake. She went to bed early, her mind already working through scenarios, calculating angles and responses. She'd spent 9 months preparing for an opportunity to prove herself. Tomorrow, that opportunity would come in a form she hadn't expected. But she'd be ready. She'd spent her entire life being ready. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The morning of the gauntlet arrived with clear skies and temperatures already climbing toward uncomfortable. Irene completed her pre-dawn routine, then made her way to the combat house, a specialized training facility designed to simulate urban warfare environments. The structure was a maze of rooms, corridors, and stairwells where trainees would face their opponents in realistic scenarios. Sergeant Dalton stood at the entrance, flanked by his assistant instructors and medical personnel. "Listen up," he called as the trainees assembled. "You'll enter the combat house individually. Inside, you'll face opponents positioned throughout the structure. Your objective is to neutralize each threat and reach the extraction point on the roof. You have 20 minutes to complete the course." He gestured toward the scoring officials who would be monitoring from observation posts. "You're being evaluated on technique, tactical decision-making, and adaptability. Excessive force results in point deductions. Failure to neutralize a threat results in course failure. Medical personnel are standing by, but understand that injuries are your responsibility to avoid through proper technique." The trainees drew lots for their order of entry. Irene drew number 14, placing her roughly in the middle of the pack. She watched as the first soldiers entered the combat house, listening to the sounds of combat echoing from within shouts, bodies hitting mats, the occasional cry of pain when someone took a hard fall. Most trainees emerged successful but battered, their faces showing the strain of fighting through multiple opponents. A few failed to complete the course, either tapping out due to injury or being overwhelmed by the scenarios inside. The pass rate was holding at about 60%, consistent with previous qualification courses. When Irene's number was called, she approached the entrance with her heart rate elevated, but her mind clear. Dalton gave her a long look before nodding toward the door. "Remember your training, Hill. Technique over strength. Speed over power. Stay aware." She nodded and entered the combat house. The first room was dimly lit, simulating a building interior with poor visibility. She moved carefully, her eyes adjusting to the darkness, when the first opponent emerged from a doorway to her right. It was Corporal Hayes, the wrestler she'd submitted during grappling week. Hayes came forward aggressively, trying to use his size to intimidate. But Irene had fought him before and knew his patterns. When he reached for her, she slipped to the outside of his grip, controlling his wrist and using his forward momentum to throw him off balance. A quick trip sent Hayes sprawling, and she transitioned immediately to a control position, securing a submission that forced him to tap out. "Good technique," Hayes muttered as he released him. There was respect in his voice now, none of the earlier resentment. Irene moved to the next room where two opponents waited. Scenarios were escalating in, difficulty as designed. She handled them efficiently, using footwork to prevent them from coordinating their attacks, picking them off individually with precise strikes and quick submissions. The fourth room brought 3 opponents, and Irene's tactical awareness became crucial. She positioned herself so they couldn't surround her, using furniture and walls to limit their angles of attack. When one rushed forward, she countered with a throw that sent him into his companion, creating chaos she exploited ruthlessly. She was making good time, moving through the course faster than most previous trainees. The extraction point was just 2 rooms away when she entered a large training space and found herself facing 12 soldiers arranged in a semicircle, blocking her path forward. She recognized them all, Torres and 10 others who'd been part of the overheard conversation, plus 2 more who'd apparently been recruited to their cause. They weren't spread throughout rooms as the scenario design intended. They were coordinated, waiting, their expressions mixing anticipation with something darker. Torres stepped forward, his voice carrying false courtesy. "Wrong place, girl. This isn't where you belong." The observation window above showed Dalton and the scoring officials watching intently. This wasn't part of the standard scenario. Everyone knew it. But it was happening anyway, and Irene was trapped in a room with 12 soldiers who decided to teach her a lesson about knowing her place. She took a slow breath, assessing distances, calculating angles. 12 opponents, 60 seconds until Dalton would likely intervene and stop the scenario. 60 seconds to prove, once and for all, that she belonged exactly where she stood. Irene settled into her stance, her body relaxed, her mind absolutely clear. "Then move me," she said quietly. They rushed forward together. The first soldier reached her 2 steps ahead of the others, Private Torres, his confidence turning his attack reckless. Irene waited until he committed to his strike, then exploded into motion. She slipped inside his punch, her shoulder driving into his chest as her leg hooked behind his knee. The classic Sambo trip sent Torres crashing to the mat with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. But she couldn't celebrate or consolidate. 11 more were coming. The second and third attackers arrived simultaneously from different angles. Irene's years of training took over, her body moving through techniques she'd practiced thousands of times. She ducked under a wild haymaker from her left, using the attacker's momentum to guide him past her and into the path of his companion. They collided in a tangle of limbs, buying her precious seconds. A 4th soldier grabbed her from behind, trying to lock a rear chokehold. It was a mistake. He'd committed both arms to the attempt, leaving himself defensively vulnerable. Irene dropped her weight suddenly, breaking his grip structure, then drove her elbow backward into his solar plexus. As he gasped and released, she turned into him, hooked his leg, and executed a throw that sent him sprawling into 2 more attackers who were approaching. 8 seconds had elapsed. 7 soldiers down or neutralized, 5 still coming. The remaining attackers showed more caution now, having watched their companions fail. They tried to coordinate, spreading out to surround her. But the room's layout worked in Irene's favor. Equipment racks and training mats created obstacles that prevented them from attacking simultaneously. She kept moving, never allowing herself to be pinned in place. When 2 soldiers tried to grab her together, she dropped low and swept the legs of the nearest one, then used his falling body as a shield against the second attacker. The chaos created by falling bodies became her ally, disrupting their coordination and forcing them to react individually rather than as a unit. A knee struck her ribs. She'd been hit, the first solid contact any of them had made. Pain flared, but adrenaline dulled it. She captured the leg before it could retract, twisted sharply, and sent her attacker spinning to the ground. A quick heel strike to his thigh numbed the muscle, effectively removing him from the fight. 15 seconds. 10 down, 2 remaining. These last 2 were more skilled. She recognized them as infantry specialists who'd ranked in the top 10 of the course. They approached carefully, trying to use their size and reach advantages. But Irene had fought bigger opponents her entire life. Size meant nothing if you couldn't land your attacks. She feinted toward one, drawing his defensive reaction, then pivoted to the other. Her striking combination was perfectly executed, a low kick to compromise his base, a straight punch to occupy his hands, then a level change into a takedown that he never saw coming. He hit the mat hard, and she transitioned immediately into a mounted position, delivering controlled strikes until he tapped out. The final soldier rushed her as she stood, perhaps hoping to catch her fatigued. But Irene's conditioning was exceptional, built through years of training that these soldiers had never witnessed. She met his rush with perfect timing, redirected his energy, and threw him with a technique so clean it could have been used in an instructional video. 23 seconds had elapsed from the first attack to the last soldier hitting the mat. The room fell silent except for the groaning of injured soldiers and the heavy breathing of those struggling to stand. Irene stood in the center of the chaos, her uniform disheveled, a bruise already forming on her ribs where she'd been struck, but otherwise unharmed. 12 soldiers lay scattered around her in various states of defeat. Above, through the observation window, she could see Sergeant Dalton's face. His expression was unreadable, but his assistant instructors were clearly shocked, their mouths hanging open as they stared at the scene below. Torres pushed himself to sitting position, wincing from the impact that had opened the engagement. He looked at Irene with something between disbelief and dawning respect. "How technique," Irene said quietly, the same word she'd used weeks earlier. "And preparation." The observation room door burst open, and Sergeant Dalton descended the stairs into the training space with controlled fury radiating from every step. The 12 soldiers scrambled to their feet as best they could, several limping, others nursing bruised egos along with their physical injuries. Irene stood at attention, her breathing finally beginning to slow, watching as Dalton assessed the scene. "What?" Dalton said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Was that?" Torres stepped forward, wincing slightly. "Sergeant, That was a question for Hill," Dalton interrupted, his eyes fixed on Irene. "Specialist Hill, did you just engage 12 opponents simultaneously in a scenario designed for sequential encounters?" "Yes, Sergeant." "And did you neutralize all 12 within—" He glanced at his stopwatch. 23 seconds? "Yes, Sergeant." Dalton turned his attention to Torres and the others. "And you 12 decided that the standard scenario wasn't sufficient? That you needed to coordinate an ambush against a fellow trainee?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Several of the soldiers stared at the floor, unable to meet Dalton's gaze. The sergeant's jaw worked as he struggled to control his anger. "You 12 are dismissed from this course, effective immediately. Your qualification attempts are terminated. You'll report to Captain Brennan's office at 1,400 hours to explain why you violated scenario protocols and endangered a fellow soldier." "Sergeant," Torres protested weakly, "we just wanted to—" "I don't care what you wanted, Private. You coordinated an attack outside the parameters of the training scenario. That's not combat. Readiness. That's misconduct." Dalton's voice could have cut steel. "The fact that Hill handled all 12 of you is the only reason you're not facing more serious consequences. Now get out of my training facility." The 12 soldiers filed out, several casting backward glances at Irene that now held unmistakable respect rather than resentment. When they'd gone, Dalton approached Irene, studying her with an intensity that made her want to step back. She held her ground. "Your rib," he said, noticing how she favored her left side slightly. "How bad?" "Bruised, Sergeant." "Not broken. You're certain?" "Yes, Sergeant. I've had broken ribs." "This isn't that." Dalton nodded slowly, then said something Irene never expected to hear. "That was the most impressive display of combatives I've witnessed in 20 years of teaching this course. Your technique was flawless. Your tactical awareness was exceptional. Your conditioning allowed you to maintain effectiveness against multiple opponents, when most soldiers would have been overwhelmed." He paused, then added, "You've been training in secret this entire deployment, haven't you? The early morning workouts, the private practice sessions, all preparing for an opportunity like this." "Yes, Sergeant. Why didn't you demonstrate these capabilities earlier?" Why let everyone underestimate you for 9 months? Irene considered her answer carefully. Because being underestimated meant being left alone, Sergeant. I could train without interference, prepare without scrutiny, and when the opportunity came, I'd be ready to exceed every expectation rather than merely meeting them. A ghost of a smile crossed Dalton's weathered face. You manipulated the situation, used their dismissal as camouflage for your preparation. I used what I had, Sergeant. Dalton studied her for another long moment, then nodded. Complete the course, Hill. The extraction point is still waiting. Your time is still running. Irene completed the final 2 rooms of the combat house without incident, reaching the extraction point with the fastest time recorded in the course's history. When she emerged onto the roof, the remaining trainees who'd gathered to watch the outcomes broke into spontaneous applause. Several approached to shake her hand, their respect genuine and unforced. Word of what happened spread through Camp Valor with the speed of wildfire. By evening mess, every soldier on base had heard some version of the story, usually exaggerated, sometimes inaccurate, but always centered on the same core truth. The small logistics clerk everyone had dismissed had taken down 12 soldiers in under a minute. Captain Brennan called Irene to his office the following morning. She entered expecting consequences for her role in the incident, but found instead a very different conversation waiting. Brennan sat behind his desk, but standing beside him was Colonel Ashford, the base commander, a woman Irene had never directly interacted with. During her deployment, Specialist Hill, Ashford began without preamble. I reviewed the recording of yesterday's incident multiple times. I've also reviewed your complete service record, including records we've obtained from your martial arts background before enlistment. Irene stood at attention, unsure where this was leading. You have exceptional capabilities that we've been wasting on inventory management, Ashford continued. Sergeant Dalton has recommended you for immediate transfer to our combat instruction program. You'd be training other soldiers in hand-to-hand combat techniques. Captain Brennan has endorsed this recommendation. The words took a moment to register. Not punishment, not even merely passing the qualification course. A complete reassignment to combat instruction, teaching others the skills she'd been hiding for 9 months. However, Ashford added, I want to understand something first. Why did you hide your abilities? You could have requested combat assignment during initial placement. Instead, you accepted logistics and kept your training secret. Why? Irene had anticipated this question. Ma'am, I believed that demonstrating capabilities would be more effective than claiming them. If I'd requested combat assignment based on civilian martial arts training, I'd have been seen as arrogant or delusional. By accepting my assigned role and waiting for an opportunity to prove myself through performance rather than promises, I ensured that when recognition came, it would be based on demonstrated competence rather than theoretical potential. Ashford exchanged a glance with Brennan, then returned her attention to Irene. That's a remarkably sophisticated understanding of military culture for someone 9 months into their first deployment. I learned quickly. Ma'am. Clearly, Ashford picked up a folder from Brennan's desk. Your transfer orders are being processed. You'll begin instructor training next week. Sergeant Dalton will be your mentor. He says you have the potential to be one of the finest combatives instructors he's worked with. Irene allowed herself a small smile. Thank you, ma'am. The transition from logistics specialist to combat instructor happened faster than Irene anticipated. Within a week, she found herself standing in the same training facility where she'd faced down 12 soldiers, but now wearing the instructor's vest that marked her new role. Sergeant Dalton stood beside her as the first group of trainees filed in for the morning session. They're going to test you, Dalton said quietly. New instructor, small frame, female. Some of them will assume you got this position through luck or politics rather than skill. You'll need to establish credibility immediately. Irene nodded, watching the soldiers assemble. She recognized several faces from her time in logistics soldiers who'd barely acknowledged her existence when she was counting equipment. Now they studied her with curiosity. mixed with skepticism. One soldier in particular, Sergeant Crawford from the infantry unit, made no effort to hide his doubt. "All right, listen up," Dalton called out. "This is Specialist Hill. She's your new hand-to-hand combat instructor. Some of you may have heard stories about her recent qualification performance. Today, you're going to learn why those stories don't do justice to her actual capabilities." Crawford raised his hand. "Sergeant Dalton, with respect, don't combat instructors usually have more field experience? Hill's been here 9 months in logistics." It was a fair question, asked with just enough edge to be a challenge. Dalton turned to Irene. "Hill, would you like to address that concern?" Irene stepped forward, her voice calm and clear. "You're right, Sergeant Crawford. I don't have extensive field experience. What I have is 8 years of competitive martial arts training, thousands of hours of technical practice, and a recent demonstration where I neutralized 12 opponents in 23 seconds. If you'd like to evaluate whether that qualifies me to teach this course, I'm happy to provide a practical demonstration." The room fell silent. Crawford's expression shifted from skepticism to calculation. He was a veteran infantryman, 6 feet tall and powerfully built. Fighting an instructor, even in a training context, was risky. But backing down from the challenge would undermine his credibility with his peers. "Just a demonstration, Sergeant," Crawford said, standing. "Help me understand your teaching methods." Dalton nodded approval. "Standard sparring rules, 3-minute round, controlled contact." "Hill, show him what you've got." They moved to the center mat, and Irene felt the familiar calm settle over her. This wasn't about dominance or humiliation. It was about establishing that she belonged in this role, that her instruction would be based on proven technique rather than theoretical knowledge. Crawford needed to understand that, and so did everyone else watching. The round began with Crawford testing her defense, throwing measured strikes to gauge her reactions. Irene moved efficiently, slipping and parrying without wasted motion. She could feel him increasing the intensity, his confidence growing as he found a rhythm. He was skilled, no question, but he was also predictable. 30 seconds into the round, Irene shifted from pure defense to counters. When Crawford threw his next combination, she slipped inside his guard and executed a perfect double-leg takedown. Crawford hit the mat hard, his surprise evident. Before he could recover, Irene had transitioned to side control, her weight distributed in a way that made it nearly impossible for him to bridge or escape. "This is the problem with relying on strength," Irene said, loud enough for the watching trainees to hear. "Sergeant Crawford is bigger and stronger than me, but position and technique trump strength every time. Notice how my weight is distributed across his chest and shoulder. He can't generate enough power to buck me off because I'm controlling his structure." She demonstrated the principle by allowing Crawford to attempt an escape, then effortlessly countering his movement and improving her position. After several failed attempts, Crawford tapped the mat in acknowledgement. Irene released immediately and offered her hand to help him up. Crawford accepted the hand, his expression now showing respect rather than skepticism. "Point made, Specialist. I'm ready to learn." The rest of the session proceeded smoothly. Irene taught fundamental positioning concepts, demonstrating each technique first on Dalton, then having the trainees practice on each other while she circulated to make corrections. Her teaching style was precise and patient, breaking down complex movements into comprehensible steps. By the end of the session, even the most skeptical trainees were engaged and asking questions. Irene had established something more valuable than dominance. She had established credibility through competent instruction backed by demonstrable skill. Over the following weeks, Irene's reputation as an instructor grew throughout Camp Valor. Her classes were consistently overbooked, with soldiers requesting transfers into her sessions, even when it meant training outside their normal duty hours. She taught with a combination of technical precision and practical application that resonated with soldiers who'd seen combat and knew the stakes of inadequate training. But success brought new challenges. Not everyone appreciated the attention she was receiving. Some of the veteran instructors, men who'd been teaching combatives for years, began to resent the newcomer who'd seemingly appeared from nowhere to claim a position they felt should have required more traditional qualifications. The tension came to a head during an instructor meeting where Dalton was discussing curriculum changes. Staff Sergeant Paulson, a 15-year infantry veteran who ran the weapons retention course, interrupted Dalton's presentation. "I think we need to address the elephant in the room," Paulson said, his tone carefully neutral. "We've got an instructor with 9 months of service and 0 combat deployments teaching soldiers who'll be going into hostile situations. That's a liability we need to discuss." Other instructors shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded agreement. Dalton's expression hardened, but before he could respond, Irene spoke up. "You're right, Staff Sergeant. I haven't been in combat. I can't teach from deployment experience." She paused, making eye contact with Paulson. "But I can teach technique that works regardless of context. The armbar I teach will break an elbow in training or in combat. The defensive positioning I demonstrate will protect against strikes whether they come from a sparring partner or an enemy combatant. Technique isn't everything," Paulson countered. "Combat involves chaos, stress, fear. You can't understand that from a training mat." "Then help me understand it," Irene replied. "Share your combat experience with me. Let me incorporate your practical knowledge into my technical instruction." "We're not competitors, Staff Sergeant. We're colleagues trying to prepare soldiers for the worst situations they'll face." The room fell silent as Paulson considered her words. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, Hill, you want to learn about combat stress? I'll show you. Tomorrow morning, 0500 hours. We're running a combined scenario, your techniques under my combat stress conditions." It was both an olive branch and a challenge. Irene accepted immediately. "I'll be there, Staff Sergeant." The scenario Paulson designed was brutal. Irene would be subjected to stress positions, physical exhaustion, and sensory overload before being thrown into combat scenarios where she'd need to apply her techniques under conditions approximating real combat chaos. It was the kind of test that broke even experienced soldiers. Irene arrived at 0500 to find Paulson and 3 assistant instructors waiting. "Here's how this works," Paulson explained. "You're going to do an hour of high-intensity conditioning. Then we're putting you in full gear, adding 40 pounds of equipment weight. Then you're going into the combat house where you'll face opponents while we simulate combat stress, strobe lights, loud noises, smoke. You'll be exhausted, disoriented, and overloaded. That's when we'll see if your technique holds up." The conditioning hour was designed to break her. Burpees, sprints, fireman carries with weighted dummies, all performed in the humid morning heat until her uniform was soaked with sweat and her muscles screamed. But Irene had been preparing for moments like this her entire life. She pushed through the exhaustion, maintaining form even when her body begged her to quit. The gear added another dimension of difficulty. 40 pounds of equipment changed her center of gravity, restricted her movement, tested her adaptation, but Sambo had taught her to fight from compromised positions, to adjust technique to circumstances rather than requiring perfect conditions. When she entered the combat house, the sensory assault was immediate. Strobe lights destroyed her visual processing. Smoke machines filled the air with thick fog that burned her lungs. Speakers blasted chaotic noise, explosions, gunfire, screaming. And somewhere in that chaos, opponents were waiting. The first attacker came from her blind side, grabbing her in a bear hug that pinned her arms. In training, she'd have had clear vision and stable footing. Here, exhausted and disoriented, she had only muscle memory and technique. She dropped her weight, created space, and executed a hip throw that sent her attacker stumbling into the smoke. The scenario continued for 20 minutes that felt like hours. Irene fought through exhaustion and sensory overload, adapting her techniques to the chaos surrounding her. Each opponent presented different challenges. Some tried to use the smoke as cover, others relied on her disorientation to land strikes she couldn't see coming. But her training held. The fundamentals she drilled thousands of times operated on autopilot, her body executing techniques even when her conscious mind struggled to process the overwhelming stimulus. When the scenario finally ended and the lights came up, Irene stood in the center of the combat house, breathing heavily, her gear soaked with sweat, but having successfully neutralized every threat Paulson had thrown at her. The staff sergeant emerged from the observation room, his expression unreadable. "That," Paulson said slowly, "was impressive. I designed that scenario to break you, Hill, to prove that technique fails under real combat stress." He paused, then extended his hand. "You just proved me wrong. Your technique didn't just hold up, it thrived. You adapted to every variable I introduced." Irene shook his hand, too exhausted to speak but grateful for the acknowledgement. Paulson turned to the assistant instructors who'd been watching. "From now on, Hill's technical instruction is integrated into all our combat stress scenarios. She's proven she understands how to make technique work when it matters most." Word of Irene's performance in Paulson's scenario spread quickly. The remaining skeptics among the instructor cadre were convinced. More importantly, the trainees heard about it and their respect for her instruction deepened. They understood now that she wasn't just teaching theory. She was teaching principles that functioned under the worst conditions they might face. 3 months into her instructor role, Colonel Ashford called Irene to headquarters for an unexpected meeting. When Irene arrived, she found not just Ashford, but several other senior officers she didn't recognize. Their uniforms bore insignia from different branches: Army, Marines, even Special Operations Command. "Specialist Hill," Ashford began, "your instruction methods have drawn attention beyond Camp Valor. These officers represent a joint task force developing new hand-to-hand combat curriculum for special operations training. They've been reviewing recordings of your sessions, and they're impressed with your technical precision and teaching methodology." A Marine colonel leaned forward. "Specialist, we're creating a standardized combatives program for Tier 1 operators. Small unit fighters who need maximum effectiveness with minimum size and strength requirements. Your approach emphasizing technique and leverage over physical attributes is exactly what we're looking for. We'd like you to join the curriculum development team," an Army major added. "You'd be working with elite fighters from multiple branches, helping design training that will be implemented across special operations community." Irene struggled to process what she was hearing. 6 months ago, she'd been counting equipment in a supply depot, dismissed as too small to matter. Now she was being recruited to train the military's most elite operators. "There's one complication," Ashford said. "This assignment would require you to attend the Special Operations Combatives Instructor course. It's a 12-week program with a 70% failure rate. You'd be the first woman to attempt it, and likely the smallest candidate they've ever had." "When do I start?" Irene asked without hesitation. The officers exchanged glances, clearly having expected more questions or concerns. The Marine colonel smiled. "That's the attitude we're looking for. Course begins in 2 weeks at Fort Bragg. Pack for intensive training and prepare to be challenged beyond anything you've experienced." After the meeting, as Irene walked back to her quarters, she reflected on the impossible journey of the past 6 months. From invisible logistics clerk to combat instructor to special operations curriculum developer. Each step had seemed impossible until she'd proven otherwise. She thought about the 12 soldiers who'd cornered her in the combat house, intending to teach her a lesson about knowing her place. They'd learned a lesson that day, but not the one they'd intended to teach. They'd learned that places weren't assigned by size or gender or preconceptions. Places were earned through preparation, competence, and the courage to prove yourself when everyone said you couldn't. The Special Operations Combatives Instructor course at Fort Bragg was designed to break candidate. Irene arrived to find herself among 23 other students, all male, most significantly larger than her, all with extensive military experience. Several were already qualified instructors from various units. Others were operators returning from deployment specifically to acquire advanced teaching credentials. The lead instructor, Master Sergeant Vance was a legendary figure in military combative circles. He'd been teaching hand-to-hand combat for 20 years and had personally trained thousands of special operations personnel. During the first formation, his eyes swept across the assembled candidates and stopped on Irene. "We've got a historic first this cycle," Vance announced. "Specialist Hill is our first female candidate. She comes highly recommended by Colonel Ashford and has apparently made quite an impression at Camp Valor." He paused, his expression neutral. Recommendations and reputation mean nothing here. This course will determine whether you're qualified to teach our nation's most elite warriors. Size, gender, background, none of it matters. Only performance. The first week was pure assessment. Every candidate was tested on striking, grappling, weapons retention, teaching methodology, and physical conditioning. Irene found herself constantly being evaluated, not just on her own performance, but on how she compared to the larger, stronger candidates around her. During grappling assessments, she was paired against a Navy SEAL named Hendricks, who outweighed her by 90 pounds. The evaluation required her to demonstrate defensive techniques from disadvantaged positions, exactly the kind of scenario where size should have mattered most. Hendricks was skilled and powerful, using his weight advantage to establish dominant positions. But Irene had spent her entire martial arts career fighting larger opponents. She understood that defense from inferior positions wasn't about strength, it was about timing, leverage, and creating opportunities from chaos. When Hendricks secured mount position, seeming to have complete control, Irene waited for the precise moment when he shifted his weight to attack. That microscopic gap in his base was all she needed. She bridged explosively, trapped his arm, and reversed their positions in a movement so smooth that observers initially thought Hendricks had allowed it. Again, Vance called, "Hendricks, don't give her anything." They reset, and Hendricks attacked with full intensity, determined to prove the reversal had been luck. But Irene defended every attack, escaped every submission attempt, and eventually forced Hendricks to tap to a triangle choke that she'd set up through 3 moves of patient positioning. Vance nodded slowly. "He'll explain what you just did." Irene stood, still catching her breath. In a disadvantaged position against a larger opponent, you can't fight strength with strength. You have to make them work, tire them out, wait for them to overcommit. Hendricks has excellent technique, but he relies on his size to maintain positions. When I felt him shift weight to attack, I knew his base was momentarily compromised. That's when defense becomes offense. And the submission sequence, Vance pressed. 3-move setup. First position opened the angle. Second position threatened a different submission, forcing him to defend. Third position capitalized on his defensive posture to secure the actual finish. Against larger opponents, you have to chain techniques because single attempts won't work. Vance turned to address all the candidates. This is precisely what we're teaching in this course. Hill just demonstrated principles that work for anyone, regardless of size. Study what she did, understand why it worked. That's how you become instructors rather than just practitioners. The weeks that followed tested every dimension of Irene's capabilities. She taught classes that were critiqued by master instructors. She designed lesson plans that were analyzed and revised. She sparred with elite operators who'd seen real combat and needed to be convinced that her techniques would work in life or death situations. Several candidates dropped from the course, unable to meet the physical demands or teaching standards. Others were dismissed for failing to demonstrate sufficient technical knowledge. By week 8, only 14 of the original 24 remained. Irene was still among them, consistently ranking in the top tier of candidates despite being by far the smallest. The final evaluation of the Special Operations Combatives Instructor course was legendary for its difficulty. Candidates would teach a 30-minute class to actual Special Operations personnel, then demonstrate their techniques against resisting opponents while being evaluated by a panel of master instructors. The failure rate for the final evaluation historically ran above 40%, even among candidates who'd excelled throughout the course. Irene drew the morning slot on evaluation day. She stood before a class of Green Berets, Rangers, and SEALs operators whose lives might one day depend on the techniques she was about to teach. Master Sergeant Vance sat in the back with his evaluation board, clipboards ready, expressions neutral. "Good morning," Irene began, her voice steady despite the pressure. "Today, we're covering defensive principles against larger, stronger opponents. This isn't theoretical for me. I've spent my entire career as the smaller fighter. Everything I'm about to show you, I've tested against opponents who had every physical advantage." She demonstrated a progression of techniques, each building on the previous one, explaining not just the movements, but the principles that made them work. When she called for a volunteer to help demonstrate, a Ranger built like a linebacker stepped forward. His name tape read Morrison, and his expression suggested he expected to dominate the demonstration. Irene invited his attack and then systematically broke down how to defend from disadvantaged positions, escape from bad situations, and create offensive opportunities from defensive postures. Morrison attacked with real intensity, and Irene handled every assault with technical precision, explaining her decision-making process throughout. "Notice I'm not trying to overpower him," she told the class while maintaining a defensive frame. "Against Morrison's pressure, I'm managing distance, controlling his posture, waiting for mistakes. There, he posted his hand too far forward. That's my escape." She demonstrated the technique, flowing from defense to a sweep that put Morrison on his back. The class was engaged, asking technical questions, requesting clarification on details. Irene answered each query with precision, sometimes having Morrison attack again to demonstrate specific points. By the end of 30 minutes, even the skeptical operators were nodding approval. The second phase of evaluation required her to spar against 3 opponents selected by the review board. The first was Hendricks, the SEAL she'd submitted during initial assessments. He'd improved significantly over the past weeks and came at her with controlled aggression. The match was competitive, technical, ending with mutual respect and no clear victor, exactly what the evaluators wanted to see. The second opponent was one of the course instructors, a man who'd been teaching combatives for a decade. He tested her adaptability, throwing techniques she hadn't seen before, forcing her to problem solve in real time. Irene handled the challenge by reverting to fundamental principles, proving that solid foundations could handle unexpected variables. The third match was against another candidate, a Marine Force recon operator named Torres, who'd been the top performer throughout the course. This wasn't just evaluation, it was a test of whether Irene belonged among the elite. They fought for 5 intense minutes, exchanging positions, neither able to secure a definitive advantage. When time expired, both were exhausted but had demonstrated exactly the level of skill the course demanded. Master Sergeant Vance stood to address the evaluation panel. "Gentlemen, your assessment?" The panel members conferred briefly. Then the senior evaluator spoke. "Specialist Hill demonstrates exceptional technical knowledge, superior teaching, methodology, and the ability to perform under pressure against elite opponents. Her understanding of leverage-based systems makes her uniquely qualified to teach operators who may face larger adversaries. Recommendation: pass with distinction." Vance nodded, then addressed Irene directly. "Hill, you're now qualified as a Special Operations Combatives instructor. More importantly, you've earned the respect of every operator in this room. That matters more than any certificate." 2 weeks later, Irene stood in a briefing room at Special Operations Command Headquarters. The Joint Task Force had assembled to finalize the new combatives curriculum she'd helped develop. Officers from every branch were present, along with several operators who'd be piloting the new training program. Colonel Ashford, who'd made the trip specifically for this meeting, stood to address the assembly. "The curriculum we're implementing today represents a fundamental shift in how we approach hand-to-hand combat. Training. We're moving away from size and strength-dependent techniques towards systems that work for any operator, regardless of physical attributes. This change is largely due to the work of Specialist Hill. The presentation of the new curriculum took 3 hours. Irene demonstrated key techniques, explained the pedagogical progression, and answered detailed questions from the assembled officers and operators. Her confidence had grown exponentially from the uncertain logistics clerk who'd stood in a briefing room 9 months ago, ignored and dismissed. When the presentation concluded, a Delta Force operator raised his hand. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 12 years. I've trained in a dozen different systems. What you've put together here is the most practical, applicable combatives program I've encountered. The fact that it comes from someone who's had to overcome size disadvantages their entire career makes it even more valuable. Thank you." The room erupted in applause. Irene felt emotion rising in her throat, but maintained her composure. This was what she'd been working toward, not recognition for its own sake, but the opportunity to contribute something meaningful, to prove that limitations existed only until someone refused to accept them. After the meeting, Colonel Ashford approached her. "Hill, you've exceeded every expectation. You've gone from logistics specialist to special operations curriculum developer in less than a year. That's unprecedented. I was ready when the opportunity came, ma'am." Irene replied, "I spent 9 months preparing for a chance that might never have arrived. And if it hadn't, if you'd spent your entire deployment counting equipment?" Irene considered the question. "Then I'd have left the military knowing I'd prepared myself to the absolute best of my ability. The outcome wasn't guaranteed, but the preparation was under my control. That was enough." Ashford smiled. "That attitude is exactly why you're here. Most people wait for circumstances to change. You changed yourself and forced circumstances to adapt." 6 months later, Irene stood in the same combat training facility where she'd faced 12 opponents in 60 seconds. But this time, she was conducting an instructor certification course, teaching a new generation of combat instructors the curriculum she'd helped develop. Among her students was Sergeant Crawford, the skeptical infantryman who challenged her during her first day as an instructor. During a break, Crawford approached her. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you. Before your course, I taught combatives the way I'd been taught, emphasizing strength and aggression. Your system has made me a better instructor and probably saved lives by giving smaller operators techniques that actually work for them. That's why we do this, Sergeant," Irene replied. "Every soldier deserves training that works for their body type and capabilities, not just for the biggest and strongest." As the course continued, Irene reflected on her journey. The morning she'd stood in the combat house facing 12 soldiers intent on teaching her a lesson seemed like years ago, though barely 12 months had passed. Those 60 seconds had changed everything, not because she'd won a fight, but because she'd proven that preparation, technique, and determination could overcome any perceived limitation. She thought about all the soldiers she'd trained, the curriculum she'd developed, the barriers she'd broken. But more than personal achievement, she thought about the operators who'd go into dangerous situations with techniques that might save their lives, techniques that worked regardless of size or strength. That evening, Irene received an email from Private Torres, one of the 12 soldiers who'd confronted her in the combat house. He completed his own combat training qualification and was being assigned to a forward unit. His email was brief, but meaningful. "Thank you for teaching me. That wrong place just means a chance to prove everyone wrong. Deploying next month with skills I learned from your curriculum. You probably saved my life before I even got to the fight." Irene saved the email. It represented everything she'd been working toward, not recognition or rank or prestige, but the knowledge that her refusal to accept limitations had created something larger than herself. She walked out to the training yard as the sun set over Fort Bragg. Tomorrow, she'd teach another class, refine another technique, help another soldier understand that size didn't determine strength. It was work that mattered, work she'd earned through years of preparation that no one had witnessed. The 12 soldiers who'd cornered her that day had intended to teach her about knowing her place. Instead, they learned that place wasn't something assigned by others. Place was something you claimed through competence, preparation, and the courage to prove yourself when everyone said you couldn't. Irene smiled as she headed back to her quarters. Somewhere out there, another soldier was being told they were too small, too weak, too different to belong. She hoped they'd hear her story. She hoped they'd understand that limitations were just opinions waiting to be proven wrong. All it took was preparation, opportunity, and 60 seconds to change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.